A flower-selling girl is humiliated by the rich until a millionaire discovers her talent and changes her life. But something unexpected happens. Mary had only lived 12 years, but life had already taught her lessons that some adults never learn. Since her father's death in a work accident, her small world had tilted off its axis. Responsibility pressed on her tiny shoulders with the weight of 1,000 stones. Her mother, Helena, was ill, too ill to work, and the money was always running out. There was no time to complain or cry. Mary's only option was to keep moving. Every morning, before the streets awoke, Mary would wander the open fields nearby, her hands quick and delicate as she picked wildflowers. She had a knack for spotting beauty where others saw weeds, a daisy blooming alone in the dirt or violets hiding in the shade. Back at home, she arranged them into modest bouquets. Nothing extravagant, just a few blooms tied together with twine, simple yet striking in their natural charm. She poured her heart into those arrangements, hoping someone would notice the effort she put into each one. Once her flowers were ready, she would take the bus into the heart of the city, where the streets were crowded with well-dressed people rushing through their lives. Her spot was outside a luxury store with sleek glass windows that reflected a world far removed from her own. There, Mary would offer her bouquets, wearing a polite smile that often went unnoticed. Some passers-by glanced at her, their expressions blank or awkward, as if they couldn't bear to meet her eyes. Others hurried past, as though she were invisible. But Mary never let it show. Even when the rejections piled up, she kept that small smile on her face. Flowers are for anyone who sees their beauty, she would whisper to herself, a quiet reminder to stay strong. Still, there were days when even her bravery faltered. On one such afternoon, as Mary stood holding her flowers close to her chest, a group of teenagers emerged from the store. They were older than Mary, maybe 15 or 16, dressed in trendy clothes. The kind of kids whose laughter felt sharp and mean. "Look who we have here," one of the girls sneered, nudging her friend. "The little flower girl. How cute." The others giggled, already sensing her discomfort. "Hey, maybe you should try selling those things somewhere else." "Like, I don't know the dumpster," another boy added, smirking as the group erupted into laughter. Mary's grip on her flowers tightened, her knuckles turning white. "Do you seriously think anyone here is going to buy that junk?" a girl with glossy hair asked. Her tone was sugary and cruel. "People shop for real flowers, not weeds." The word stung, cutting deeper than she expected. Mary's throat tightened as tears threatened to spill, but she swallowed hard. She wouldn't let them see her cry. They didn't deserve that. Instead, she stood firm, her chin slightly raised, her voice steady. "These flowers are for people who understand what beauty really means," she said, her eyes meeting theirs without a hint of fear. The teens exchanged amused glances, then burst into mocking laughter. "Good luck with that," one of the boys said as they walked away, their laughter trailing behind them like a cloud of smoke. Mary stood there, still clutching her flowers, feeling smaller than ever. Her heart ached, not because of what they said, but because part of her wondered if they were right. Maybe her flowers really didn't belong in a place like this. Maybe she didn't belong. She exhaled slowly, trying to push away the doubt, but her hands trembled slightly. For a moment, she considered going home. She could forget about today, try again tomorrow. Her mother would understand. But then she thought of Helena, lying in bed, her breath shallow and labored, her soft smile filled with quiet apologies for being too weak to help. Mary knew what was at stake. Her mother's medication, the bills that never seemed to stop, and the fragile hope they clung to. Giving up was not an option. Just as she was about to force herself to stay a little longer, the glass door of the luxury store swung open again. This time, it wasn't a teenager coming out. It was a man, elegantly dressed in a tailored suit. He carried himself with the calm assurance of someone used to having everything under control. Mary stiffened, expecting another dismissive glance. Instead, the man's gaze landed on her flowers and lingered. These flowers, The man's voice was smooth, but there was something warm beneath it, something curious. "They're yours." Mary blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, sir," she answered cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. The man studied her bouquets with a thoughtful expression, then smiled. Genuinely smiled, not the polite kind of smile that hides pity or amusement. "They're beautiful," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Mary felt her chest swell with a mixture of surprise and relief. "Thank you, sir," she replied softly. The man tilted his head, still looking at the flowers. "I'll take them all." Mary's heart skipped a beat. "All of them?" she repeated, not sure she'd heard him right. He nodded. "Every single one." Mary fumbled with the flowers, her hands moving clumsily as if they no longer belonged to her. No one had ever bought all her bouquets at once. "But that's a lot of flowers, sir," she stammered. "Are you sure?" The man chuckled, pulling out a leather wallet. "I'm quite sure," he said, handing her a stack of bills that seemed far too generous for what she was offering. "And I'll need you to come to this address tomorrow. I have a business proposal for you." He slipped a sleek, cream-colored card into her hand. "My name's Albert. I think someone with your talent could be exactly what I need." Mary stared at the card, then back at Albert. His words didn't sound like empty flattery. There was a kindness in his voice that felt real, something she wasn't used to. "Thank you, Mr. Albert," she murmured, still stunned. Albert gave her one last smile before turning and disappearing into the busy street. That evening, when Mary returned home and told Helena what had happened, her mother's reaction wasn't quite what she expected. Helena's brows furrowed with worry, her pale hands gripping the edge of the blanket. "Mary, you need to be careful," Helena whispered. "Not everyone offers kindness without expecting something in return." Mary sat on the edge of the bed, looking down at her hands, now empty of flowers but full of possibility. "I know, Mama," she whispered back. "But I think Mr. Albert really wants to help." Helena sighed, brushing a strand of hair from Mary's face. "Just promise me you'll be careful, sweetheart." Mary nodded, though she felt something flicker inside her. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And for the first time in months, it didn't seem so far out of reach. The next day, Mary held the cream-colored business card tightly in her hand, its edges already soft from her fingers nervously rubbing it. The address on the card led her to a building unlike any she had ever seen. Tall, gleaming, and imposing. She stood frozen for a moment at the entrance, intimidated by the glass doors that opened automatically as people walked through. Everyone here seemed so polished, moving with purpose. For a moment, she doubted herself. What was she doing in a place like this? But then she thought of her mother lying in bed, her breath shallow but still filled with quiet encouragement. Mary took a breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped inside. The lobby was grand, with marble floors that reflected the sleek decor. Mary felt out of place in her worn shoes and simple dress, but she held her head high. The receptionist behind a glossy desk greeted her with a polite smile. "I'm here to see Mr. Albert," Mary said, her voice small but steady. The receptionist checked a list, nodded, and motioned for her to follow. "Right this way. Mr. Albert has been expecting you." Mary trailed behind, her heart pounding. They took the elevator up to the top floor, and the moment the doors opened, she was greeted by a wide office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city below. Albert stood near his desk, his hands in his pockets, wearing that same kind smile she remembered from the day before. "Mary, I'm glad you came," he said, motioning for her to come closer. Mary hesitated for just a moment before stepping into the room. The space felt too big, too elegant for someone like her. Albert noticed her hesitation and gave her an encouraging smile. "You don't need to be nervous. You belong here just as much as anyone else." Mary shifted on her feet, but forced herself to meet his gaze. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. Albert gestured for her to sit in one of the soft leather chairs. "Mary, you have a rare talent," he began, I need someone like you to design floral arrangements for an important event we're hosting soon, and I believe you're the right person for the job." Mary's eyes widened. She wasn't sure if she had heard him correctly. "But me," she stammered. "I don't think I'm the right person, sir. I'm just a girl who sells flowers on the street." Albert shook his head, his smile unwavering. "No, Mary, you are far more than that. You see beauty where others don't. That's not something everyone can do." Mary looked down at her hands, feeling both embarrassed and hopeful. No one had ever spoken to her like this before. Could she really be capable of something so grand? "I'll give you everything you need," Albert continued. "Materials, tools, a team to assist you. All you need to do is what you do best. Create." Mary swallowed hard, a mix of fear and excitement swirling inside her. I'll do my best, sir." Albert's smile deepened. "That's all I ask." The weeks that followed were unlike anything Mary had ever experienced. Albert kept his promise, providing her with every resource she needed. A team of professionals was assigned to assist her, though many were skeptical at first. "Are we really taking orders from a kid?" one florist whispered to another. Mary heard the murmurs but ignored them. She knew she didn't look like much, but this was her chance to prove she belonged. With quiet determination, she threw herself into the work, learning as much as she could. Albert introduced her to new types of flowers, delicate orchids, exotic lilies, and lush peonies, each with its own personality. Mary experimented with combinations she had never dreamed of, blending colors and textures in ways that felt natural to her. Day after day, she stayed late at the studio, her fingers stained with pollen and her hair full of stray petals. The more she worked, the more confident she became. She discovered that designing floral arrangements was like telling a story. Every bloom had a role to play. Every color had a purpose. Finally, the day of the event arrived. Mary stood in the grand hall, her heart racing as she surveyed the room. It was breathtaking. Every arrangement she had crafted was in perfect harmony, filling the space with elegance and color. The room seemed to glow with life, as if the flowers themselves were celebrating. Guests began to arrive, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. Mary stood quietly off to the side, watching with bated breath as people admired the arrangements. She could hear snippets of conversation. "These flowers are exquisite. Who put this together? I've never seen anything like it." A small, proud smile crept across Mary's face. For the first time, she felt seen, not just as a girl selling flowers on the street, but as someone with a gift. And then she saw them, the same group of teenagers who had humiliated her outside the luxury store. They entered the hall, dressed in sleek clothes and wearing smug expressions. Mary's heart clenched for a moment, but she didn't look away. She stood tall, determined not to let their presence ruin this moment for her. It didn't take long for them to spot her. One of the girls, her glossy hair still perfectly styled, stared at Mary, disbelief flickering across her face. "You..." The girl's voice was sharp with confusion. "You did all this?" Mary met her gaze head-on, her chin raised just slightly. "Yes," she said simply. The girl blinked, her disbelief giving way to something else. Maybe embarrassment, maybe even a sliver of respect. Before any of them could say more, Albert appeared at Mary's side, his presence commanding and calm. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his gaze shifting between the teenagers. They shifted awkwardly, avoiding his eyes. "No, sir," one of the boys mumbled, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. Albert gave a polite but firm nod, silently dismissing them. They slinked away, their earlier bravado gone. Once they were out of earshot, Albert turned to Mary, his expression softening. "You handled that well." Mary shrugged, though a small smile tugged at her lips. "I guess so." Albert placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did more than guess, Mary. You showed them exactly who you are." The warmth in his voice made Mary's chest swell with quiet pride. At the end of the night, Albert approached Mary once more, his tone serious but kind. "Mary, you exceeded every expectation. I knew you had talent, but what you've accomplished here is extraordinary." Mary ducked her head, her cheeks flushing with both pride and humility. "Thank you, sir. It was an incredible opportunity." Albert folded his arms, studying her thoughtfully. "I want to offer you a contract," he said. "You would be responsible for all the floral designs at our events moving forward." Mary's eyes widened. "But, sir, I don't know if I can. My mother needs me. I can't leave her alone." Albert paused for a moment, considering her words. Then, with a thoughtful expression, he spoke. "I understand, Mary, but what if we found a solution? I know some excellent doctors. I can make sure your mother gets the care she needs. So you don't have to worry." Mary stared at him, her heart full. "You would really do that?" Albert gave her a gentle smile. "Of course. You deserve this chance, and I want to help." For the first time in a long while, Mary felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. "Thank you, Mr. Albert," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Everything was finally falling into place. Or so she thought. Just a few days after the event that changed Mary's life, Albert sat at his desk reviewing proposals when his secretary buzzed in through the intercom. "Mr. Albert, there's a woman here asking to see you. She says it's urgent." Albert didn't look up from the papers. "What's her name?" "Beatrice." Albert's pen froze mid-stroke. For a long second, he didn't move. Beatrice. He hadn't heard that name in years. She was his sister, a relationship long fractured and carefully ignored. Their last conversation had been bitter, words exchanged that neither had bothered to repair. "Send her in," Albert said, though his tone was cautious. Moments later, the door to his office opened, and Beatrice walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She was just as he remembered, tall, poised, with the same sharpness in her eyes that always made her presence feel both familiar and unsettling. But there was something new in her expression now, a weight that made her usual confidence falter. "Albert," she said, standing awkwardly by the door, "we need to talk." Albert leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "It's been years, Beatrice. What brings you here now?" Beatrice didn't sit. She stayed near the door as if unsure whether she'd be welcome any closer. Her usual bravado was gone. "This isn't about us. It's about Mary." Albert's brow furrowed at the mention of Mary. "Mary? What about her?" Beatrice shifted her weight, folding her arms tightly across her chest, as if bracing herself for impact. "She's your daughter, Albert." The room seemed to contract in that moment. Albert stared at his sister, his mind racing to make sense of what he'd just heard. "What?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Beatrice took a step closer, her gaze steady but softened by the gravity of what she was saying. "Mary, she's your daughter." Albert shook his head, as if denying the possibility would make it untrue. That can't be." "How?" Beatrice exhaled deeply, as if the weight of the truth had been crushing her for years. "Do you remember Helena?" she asked. The name hit him like a punch to the chest. "Helena," he repeated, almost to himself. Memories came flooding back. Her warm smile, her laugh that always caught him off guard. They had shared something real, something complicated, but it had ended abruptly, with no closure. She disappeared from his life, leaving only unanswered questions in her wake. "Yes, I remember her," he said slowly. "But what does Helena have to do with Mary?" Beatrice's voice was quiet but resolute. "Helena had a child, Albert. That child is Mary." Albert stared at his sister, his mind reeling. Why didn't she tell me?" Beatrice looked away for a moment, as if the answer to that question weighed heavily on her. "She was afraid of how you'd react," Beatrice said softly. "Back then, everything between the two of you was complicated. And when she found out she was pregnant, you had already drifted apart. She thought it would be easier, simpler, if she raised Mary on her own." Albert closed his eyes, pressing his thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose, as if that could stave off the storm of emotions brewing inside him. "All this time," he muttered, "and I never knew." "Neither did I," Beatrice admitted quietly. "I only found out recently." Helena reached out. She's not doing well, Albert." Albert's eyes snapped back to Beatrice. "What do you mean?" Beatrice's voice dropped, laced with sadness. "Her health is deteriorating. That's why she decided it was time you knew the truth. She wants Mary to have a chance." Albert shot to his feet, pacing to the window, his hands clenched into fists as a wave of anger surged through him. "She had no right to keep this from me," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "I had a right to know, Beatrice. I would have been there." Beatrice remained silent, giving him the space to process the bombshell she had just dropped. Albert ran a hand through his hair, struggling to make sense of the tangled emotions swirling in his chest. Anger, regret, confusion, but above all, an overwhelming sense of loss. "Does Mary know?" he asked abruptly, turning to face Beatrice. She shook her head. "No, Helena hasn't told her yet. She wanted you to be the one." Albert's jaw tightened. "I need to see her. I need to see both of them." Beatrice nodded, her expression softening for the first time since she arrived. "I thought you might say that." Albert grabbed his coat from the back of his chair, already halfway to the door. There was no time to waste. "Where are they?" "Helena is still at home," Beatrice said. "But, Albert, you need to prepare yourself. She's not the same person you remember." Albert gave her a sharp nod, his expression unreadable. "I'll handle it." Beatrice watched as her brother strode out of the office, her heart heavy with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. As the door swung shut behind him, she whispered to herself, "Good luck, Albert." For the first time in years, Albert felt unsure of what lay ahead. The truth had finally come to light, but what that truth would bring, he wasn't certain. All he knew was that he had to see Helena, and he had to face the reality that Mary, the girl who had unknowingly changed his life, was his daughter. Albert drove to Mary's house with a knot tightening in his chest, rehearsing conversations in his head that he knew would never go exactly as planned. When he arrived, the house looked smaller than he had imagined, modest and worn with time. For a moment, he hesitated outside the door, knowing that whatever was said inside would change everything. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. The door creaked open, and Mary stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with surprise. "Mr. Albert, what are you doing here?" Albert gave her a small, tight smile, but there was no hiding the weight behind it. "Mary, I need to speak with your mother. Alone, if you don't mind." Mary's brow furrowed, suspicion flickering in her gaze. She hesitated, glancing toward the small bedroom down the hall, where her mother rested. "Is everything okay?" she asked cautiously. Albert forced himself to keep his voice steady. "It's important, Mary. Please." Reluctantly, Mary nodded and stepped aside, though her unease was clear. Albert gave her a brief, grateful nod before heading toward the bedroom door. He paused outside for a moment, his hand hovering just above the doorknob. Then, with a soft exhale, he turned it and stepped inside. Helena lay on the bed, her thin frame barely making an impression on the mattress. Her face was pale, her features drawn with fatigue, but her eyes still carried the same quiet strength that Albert remembered. She knew, without a word, why he was there. "Albert," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Albert moved closer, his expression torn between anger and sorrow. "Helena," he said softly, but his voice carried the weight of years of unanswered questions. He pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, leaning forward as if the space between them was too wide to bridge. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Why did you keep this from me all these years?" Helena closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to answer. "I was scared," she whispered. "We ended things badly, Albert. You were building your career, and I thought telling you would complicate everything. I didn't want to burden you. Albert stared at her, frustration simmering beneath his sadness. A child isn't a burden, Helena, he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. She's my daughter. I had a right to know. Helena's thin fingers trembled as she reached out for his hand. Albert took it, feeling how frail she had become. I know, she whispered, and I'm sorry. I see now that I was wrong, but back then, I was just trying to protect Mary, and maybe protect you too. Albert squeezed her hand. The resentment he had carried for the lost years slowly giving way to something deeper, a shared sorrow for what could never be undone. I want to make things right, he said, his voice quieter now. I want Mary to know the truth. Helena gave him a tired but grateful smile. She deserves that, she whispered. Albert nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. Then we tell her. Together, they called Mary into the room, and she entered slowly, her gaze shifting between the two adults. The air was heavy with unspoken tension, and her heart pounded in her chest. She had never seen her mother look so fragile, and Albert's expression was unlike anything she had seen before, something between regret and determination. What's going on? Mary asked cautiously. Why are you both acting like this? Albert stood, running a hand through his hair before looking her directly in the eyes. Mary, he paused, gathering himself. There's something you need to know, something we should have told you a long time ago. Mary's pulse quickened as she looked between Albert and her mother, confusion and unease building inside her. What is it? She asked, her voice small. Albert sat back down, his gaze steady but filled with emotion. Mary, I'm your father. The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Mary stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. What? She whispered, almost as if saying it aloud would make it make sense. Helena's soft voice broke the silence. It's true, sweetheart. Mary shook her head, feeling a strange mixture of disbelief, anger, and sadness swirling inside her. Why didn't anyone tell me? Her voice cracked, and she looked at Helena with wide, tearful eyes. Why would you keep something like this from me? Helena's eyes brimmed with tears as she reached for Mary's hand. I only wanted to protect you, she whispered. I thought it would be easier if you didn't know. I was wrong, Mary. I'm sorry. Mary's hands trembled as she pulled them away, struggling to contain the flood of emotions inside her. All these years, she whispered, more to herself than to them. You both just decided for me. Albert knelt in front of her, his eyes filled with regret. Mary, I didn't know, he said softly. I only found out a few days ago. I promise. If I had known. Mary shook her head, wiping at her eyes furiously. I don't even know what to think right now. Albert gave her space, sensing that pushing too hard would only make things worse. I understand, he said gently. Take all the time you need. I just want you to know that I'm here now. For you. For both of you. Mary looked at him, still trying to make sense of everything. A part of her wanted to push him away, to retreat into the safety of what she had always known. But another part, a quieter, deeper part, wanted to believe him. Helena's voice, fragile but full of love, cut through the silence. He's telling the truth, Mary, and he wants to be here for you. Mary sat down heavily in the chair by the bed, her mind racing. It was too much, too fast. But even through the confusion, there was something reassuring about Albert's presence. I don't know how to feel about this, she admitted quietly, looking at him with a mixture of fear and hope. Albert gave her a small, understanding smile. That's okay, he said. We'll figure it out together. Mary glanced at Helena, who gave her a weak but encouraging smile, and then back at Albert. Okay, she whispered, not knowing what the future would hold but willing, at least for now, to take the first step. In the following days, Albert wasted no time arranging the best medical care for Helena. With access to specialists and treatments that were once beyond reach, Helena's health began to show signs of improvement. She regained some of her strength, Her voice no longer a fragile whisper, and her smile, though still faint, was steady with hope. Mary stayed by her side through every step of the recovery, relieved but still cautious, as if the happiness was too delicate to fully trust. Albert visited frequently, bringing medicine, flowers, and quiet conversations. Each time he arrived, Mary found herself slowly lowering the walls she had built to protect herself. At first, their conversations were brief and awkward, small talk that neither knew how to stretch into something more meaningful. But soon, those conversations deepened. One afternoon, Albert sat at the small dining table in their modest living room, sipping tea Helena had insisted on preparing herself. Mary hesitated at first, but finally joined him, sitting across the table. "So," Albert began carefully, "I know things between us, they're complicated right now. But I want to get to know you, Mary. I want to be here for you, in whatever way you need." Mary stared down at her hands, fiddling with the chipped edge of her teacup. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "It's weird. You're a stranger, but you're also supposed to be..." She trailed off, uncertain how to finish the sentence. Albert gave her a gentle smile, understanding her hesitation. "We'll take it slow," he said. "There's no rush. And if you ever feel uncomfortable, just say so, okay?" Mary nodded, grateful for the space he was giving her. She appreciated that he wasn't trying to force anything, that he wasn't pretending they could make up for lost time in a few conversations. Slowly, the edges of her resistance softened, and she began sharing small parts of herself. Stories about school, her love for flowers, little memories with her mother. And in return, Albert told her about his life, his work, and even his mistakes. Each conversation was like placing a brick on the foundation of something fragile but real. A relationship that neither of them fully understood yet, but both were willing to build. Meanwhile, Beatrice observed all of this from the sidelines, her heart seething with bitterness. She had stayed away after the initial confrontation, waiting to see how the dust would settle. But as she watched Albert visit Mary and Helena, as she heard the way he spoke about Mary with pride, her jealousy grew like a slow-burning fire. For years, Beatrice had enjoyed a position of power and influence in Albert's company, and by extension, in his life. She was his closest confidant, the one he relied on for advice and decisions. But now, everything felt as if it were shifting. Albert's focus had shifted. "She's taking the place that should be mine," Beatrice muttered bitterly to herself one evening, pacing in her apartment. Beatrice's resentment wasn't just about the business, though that was part of it. It was personal. She had fought hard to maintain her status, always staying close to Albert, even after their parents' deaths had left them practically estranged from each other. She had learned to navigate his moods, his expectations, and the demands of the business. But now this girl, this stranger, was slipping into Albert's life as if she belonged there, and Beatrice couldn't stand it. A few days later, in the company's boardroom, Albert had just finished a meeting when Beatrice approached him with an air of forced calm. "You seem distracted these days," she said, her voice carefully measured. "It's not like you to miss small details in meetings." Albert glanced at her, already sensing the direction of the conversation. "I've had a lot on my mind," he admitted, not in the mood for pretense. Beatrice gave a tight smile, but her eyes were sharp. "I notice," she said. "Mary seems to be taking up a lot of your time." Albert set down the papers he was holding and folded his arms across his chest, his expression unreadable. "Yes, she's my daughter, Beatrice. Of course she's going to be part of my life now." There was a hint of warning in his voice, but Beatrice pressed on undeterred. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "You barely know her, Albert. And the timing, well, it's sudden, isn't it? What if? What if what?" Albert interrupted, his tone turning cold. Beatrice hesitated for only a second before continuing, her voice smooth but loaded with implication. "What if she's not who you think she is? People can have all sorts of motives. She grew up without you. How do you know she's not just here for what she can get?" Albert's jaw tightened, but he didn't immediately respond. Beatrice saw the hesitation and pushed harder. "You've built everything from the ground up, Albert. Do you really want to risk it all for someone you didn't even know existed a few weeks ago?" Albert held her gaze, his expression now rigid with suppressed anger. "I know exactly what you're doing, Beatrice, and it's not going to work." Beatrice's lips twitched into a thin smile, though her eyes remained cold. "I'm just looking out for you," she said sweetly. "That's all I've ever done." Albert's gaze darkened, and for a moment, there was a silence between them that felt sharper than any words could have been. "You're my sister," Albert said finally, his voice low and deliberate, "and I appreciate everything you've done for me and the company. But if you try to come between me and Mary, you'll regret it." Beatrice's smile faltered, her mask slipping just enough to reveal the bitterness underneath. "I just hope you know what you're doing, Albert," she murmured before turning and walking away. Albert watched her leave, his jaw tight with frustration. He knew Beatrice well enough to recognize that this wasn't the end of it. She had always been calculating, always looking for ways to maintain control. And now, she saw Mary as a threat, someone who could disrupt the balance she had carefully cultivated for years. Albert didn't doubt that Beatrice would try something. The question was what, and how far she was willing to go. In the days that followed, Albert focused on strengthening his bond with Mary, determined not to let Beatrice's words cloud his judgment. He took Mary to the flower markets downtown, showing her the bustling trade she had never seen beyond her own street corner. They spent hours selecting rare blooms, talking about color palettes, and experimenting with arrangements that would soon become the hallmark of their growing business together. But even as these moments filled Mary's heart with a cautious joy, there was always a lingering doubt, a small voice that whispered she didn't truly belong in this new world. She still felt like the girl on the outside. Peeking in, Albert sensed her hesitation one evening as they worked together in the studio. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd have a chance to be a father. And now that I do, I don't want to mess it up." Mary looked at him, startled by the vulnerability in his voice. "You're doing fine," she said softly. Albert smiled, but there was something sad in his eyes. "I know I can't make up for lost time," he said, "but I want you to know that I'm here, for as long as you'll have me." Mary's throat tightened, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. But then she gave a small, hesitant nod. "I think I'd like that," she whispered. Albert reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "Then that's all that matters," he said. But in the back of Albert's mind, Beatrice's words lingered like a shadow, reminding him that not everyone was ready to accept this new beginning. And Beatrice wasn't done yet. The tension in the boardroom was palpable. Beatrice stood at the head of the long table, her expression carefully composed, the perfect mask of concern. In front of her lay a stack of documents, thick, damning, and deliberately designed to ruin everything Mary had begun to build. Albert sat at the opposite end of the table, flipping through the papers with growing disbelief. His jaw clenched so tightly that the muscle twitched at the corner. The senior executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging wary glances. They knew better than to question Beatrice outright. Her influence in the company ran deep. "Albert," Beatrice said, her voice smooth and measured, "we can't afford to turn a blind eye to this. If these numbers are correct, Mary has been redirecting funds into a personal account for months." Albert exhaled sharply, slamming the papers onto the table. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice hard with suspicion. Beatrice didn't flinch. "It came to my attention through an internal audit," she said smoothly. "I had the team double-check everything. It's all there in black and white." Albert's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the damning spreadsheets and transaction logs. The betrayal suggested by the documents was too enormous to process. The girl he was just beginning to know as his daughter, the girl he had promised to trust, was being accused of theft. He tried to keep his voice steady, but a tremor of pain crept in. "Mary," he said slowly, "please, tell me this isn't true." Mary, who had been sitting silently at the edge of the room, felt her stomach drop. She stared at the papers as if they were written in a language she couldn't understand. Her mind raced, trying to grasp what was happening. "It's not true," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "I didn't do any of this." Albert's gaze softened for a brief moment, but the weight of the accusations pressed down on him, clouding his judgment. "Then how do you explain this?" he asked, gesturing to the papers. Tears welled in Mary's eyes as panic began to rise in her chest. "I don't know," she cried. "I've never even seen these accounts before. I would never steal from you." Beatrice leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing in mock sympathy. "We all want to believe that, Mary," she said in a voice so syrupy it stung. "But the numbers don't lie. You had access to the finances, and the missing money is tied directly to your credentials." Mary looked at Albert, desperation spilling from her eyes. "Dad, you have to believe me. I swear, I didn't do anything wrong." Albert ran a hand down his face, struggling to hold his emotions together. His heart told him to believe her, but the evidence in front of him whispered otherwise. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Beatrice pressed her advantage, sensing his hesitation. "Albert, we can't afford to be sentimental about this," she said, her tone cool but firm. "If we ignore this, it could ruin everything we've built." "I'm not ignoring it," Albert snapped, glaring at her. He trailed off, looking back at Mary. "Mary," he said softly, "please, if there's anything you need to tell me, now's the time." Mary shook her head furiously, her voice breaking. "I'm telling you the truth. I didn't do this." Albert sat back in his chair, running both hands through his hair in frustration. The doubt gnawed at him, twisting his gut in ways he wasn't prepared for. He wanted to believe her, but Beatrice's carefully presented evidence was overwhelming. "Then how did this happen?" Albert whispered, almost to himself. Beatrice, sensing the emotional fracture between them, seized the moment to deliver the final blow. "Albert, we have to think about what's best for the company," she said smoothly. "This isn't just about family, this is business. If we don't act, we could lose everything." Mary's heart shattered as she saw the conflict play out on Albert's face. "You're going to believe her over me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Albert looked at her, his eyes filled with guilt and uncertainty. "I don't want to," he admitted quietly. "But what if she's right?" Mary's breath hitched, and a sob escaped her throat. "I can't believe this," she said, her voice cracking. "You're really doubting me? After everything?" Albert leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and burying his face in his hands. "I don't know what to think," he murmured. Beatrice sat back, satisfied. She had planted the seed of distrust, and it was taking root exactly as she had planned. "We need to conduct a formal investigation," she said calmly. "It's the only way to be certain." Albert raised his head, looking at Mary with a pained expression. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he promised, though his voice lacked the conviction Mary so desperately needed to hear. Mary stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't need an investigation to prove I didn't steal from you," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "I thought you trusted me." Albert flinched as if the words physically hurt him. "I want to trust you," he said quietly, "but I have to be sure." Mary stared at him for a long moment, her heart breaking under the weight of his doubt. "I guess I was wrong about you," she whispered bitterly, turning toward the door. "Mary, wait," Albert called, but she was already gone, the door slamming shut behind her. In the silence that followed, Albert sat motionless, staring at the door she had just walked through. His heart ached in a way he hadn't expected, like he was losing her all over again before he'd even had a chance to really know her. Beatrice's voice cut through the silence, calm and practical. "It's for the best, Albert. You'll see." Albert didn't respond. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong, that Beatrice's timing was too perfect, the accusations too convenient. But for now, All he could do was wait for the investigation to uncover the truth and pray that it wasn't already too late to repair the damage. Albert sat in his office long after the boardroom confrontation, haunted by the look in Mary's eyes as she stormed out. He couldn't let it end like that. Doubt gnawing at him, tearing at the fragile relationship they had just begun to build. He needed answers, real ones. If there was any chance Mary was innocent, he owed it to her to find the truth. The next morning, Albert hired an independent forensic auditor, someone with no ties to the company. If there were lies buried in the financial documents, he would uncover them. For days, Albert stayed late at the office, poring over spreadsheets, transaction logs, and email records. Every night, he thought about Mary, wondering if she would ever forgive him. The auditor, a meticulous man named Delgado, finally called Albert into his office after a week of exhaustive digging. He tapped a folder filled with documents, his expression serious. "We found something, Mr. Albert," Delgado said. Albert leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "Tell me everything." Delgado adjusted his glasses and opened the folder. "It took some time, but we discovered that the financial records submitted as evidence were altered. The funds weren't misappropriated by Mary at all. In fact, the transactions never touched any account linked to her." Albert exhaled sharply, relief washing over him like a wave. But it wasn't just relief. There was anger, too. "Who did this?" he asked, though a part of him already knew the answer. Delgado slid another sheet of paper across the desk. "We traced the false documentation to someone with access to the internal systems. It wasn't hard to connect the dots once we knew where to look." Albert stared at the paper. At the bottom, bold and unmistakable, was Beatrice's name. His heart sank. He had suspected she might be involved, but seeing the proof laid out in black and white felt like a betrayal deeper than anything he had imagined. "Thank you, Delgado," Albert said quietly. "That'll be all for now." The auditor gave a polite nod and left, leaving Albert alone with the bitter truth. Later that day, Albert called Beatrice into his office. She entered with her usual air of confidence, though Albert noticed a flicker of unease in her eyes. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her voice light but guarded. Albert didn't bother with pretense. He held up the folder Delgado had given him. "I know what you did," he said, his voice calm but heavy with disappointment. Beatrice's smile faltered for the briefest moment before she recovered, raising an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Albert tossed the folder onto the desk between them. "The documents were falsified, Beatrice. You set Mary up. I had the records reviewed independently. It's all here. Proof that you orchestrated everything." For a moment, Beatrice didn't move. Then, as if a switch flipped inside her, the veneer of composure shattered. "So what if I did?" she snapped, her voice rising. "What was I supposed to do, Albert? Just sit back and watch you hand over everything to her?" Albert leaned back in his chair, his expression weary. "This wasn't about the company, was it?" he asked quietly. "This was about me. You couldn't stand the idea of me having someone else in my life. Someone who wasn't you." Beatrice's eyes filled with a mix of rage and frustration. "You've always chosen others over me," she cried, her voice cracking with the weight of years of resentment. "No matter how hard I worked, no matter how much I sacrificed, it was never enough for you. And now this girl shows up out of nowhere, and suddenly she gets everything." Albert closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the full weight of her words. "This was never a competition, Beatrice," he said softly. "You didn't need to fight for a place in my life. You always had won." Beatrice shook her head, her fists clenched at her sides. "Not the way I wanted," she muttered bitterly. Albert's heart ached as he looked at his sister, so consumed by jealousy and insecurity that she had nearly destroyed his relationship with Mary. "You could have talked to me," Albert said quietly. "You could have told me how you felt. But instead, you tried to tear us apart." Beatrice's breath hitched, and for a moment, Albert saw the raw vulnerability beneath her anger. But the damage was done, and they both knew it. I didn't know what else to do, Beatrice whispered, her voice hollow. Albert shook his head. Sadness etched into his features. You've gone too far, Beatrice. I can't ignore what you've done. Beatrice stared at him, realization dawning in her eyes. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice small and uncertain. Albert took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the decision he knew he had to make. You need to step away, he said firmly. From the company, from me, for a while, at least. Beatrice's eyes widened with disbelief. You're cutting me out? She whispered, as if the words physically hurt. Albert's voice softened, but the resolve in his tone was unshakable. I'm not cutting you out, but I can't let you stay if all you're going to do is destroy what I'm trying to build with Mary. Beatrice's lips trembled, but she forced herself to stand tall, masking the deep hurt beneath her anger. Fine, she spat. Do what you have to do, but don't come crying to me when she disappoints you. Albert's expression remained steady, though his heart ached for the sister he was losing. I hope you find peace, Beatrice, he said quietly, without another word. Beatrice turned on her heel and walked out of the office, slamming the door behind her. Albert sat in silence for a long time, his head in his hands. The confrontation had ended, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed heavily on his chest. He had lost his sister, at least for now, and nearly lost Mary in the process. But now, at least, the truth was out, and it was time to make things right. With Beatrice out of the picture and Helena steadily recovering, peace finally found its way into Mary's life. The tension and fear that had once felt like a constant shadow lifted, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, Mary felt like she could breathe. There was no longer the looming threat of losing everything. No more schemes, no more uncertainty about where she belonged. She had a place now, a home, a family, and a future she never thought possible. Albert stayed true to his word, working closely with Mary to expand their floral business. But it was Mary who had the vision to take things further. We could do more than just flowers, Mary had suggested one afternoon, seated across from Albert at the studio. What if we used the business to make a difference? Albert gave her a curious look. What do you have in mind? Mary leaned forward, her eyes shining with excitement. Animals. There are so many animals abandoned on the streets. I want to do something about it. Maybe build a program that combines floral design workshops with shelter events. People can come to learn about flowers and adopt a pet while they're at it. Albert sat back, a smile slowly spreading across his face. I like the way you think, he said. Let's make it happen together. They reimagined the business, transforming it into something that was more than just a floral design company. They created partnerships with animal shelters and community organizations, hosting charity events that featured Mary's floral arrangements alongside adoption drives. Every event was infused with the same care and creativity Mary poured into her bouquets. It didn't take long for word to spread. The company flourished, attracting both new clients and volunteers eager to support the mission. They began expanding to larger cities, hosting events that raised awareness about animal welfare and the power of nature's beauty. Mary, once the girl selling flowers on the street corner, had become a respected entrepreneur. But more than that, she had become a symbol of resilience, proof that life's hardships could be turned into opportunities for growth. One evening, they held a family gathering at Albert's home, a simple but meaningful celebration of how far they had come. Helena sat comfortably on the couch, a soft blanket draped over her lap, looking healthier than she had in years. Her eyes sparkled with pride as she watched Mary move through the room, greeting everyone with the same warmth she used to reserve for customers on the street. Albert poured himself a drink and sat beside Helena, who gave him a knowing smile. She's come a long way, Helena murmured, her voice filled with emotion. Albert nodded, watching Mary with quiet admiration. She's extraordinary, he said softly. And to think, I almost let everything slip away. Helena placed a hand on his arm, squeezing gently. You made things right, she said. That's what matters. Albert exhaled, feeling the truth of her words settle inside him. It hadn't been easy, rebuilding trust, confronting his own mistakes, letting go of the bitterness that had festered between him and Beatrice. But now, sitting here with Helena and seeing Mary surrounded by people who admired her, Albert felt something he hadn't in years: peace. Later that evening, after the plates had been cleared and the conversations had quieted, Mary stood up from her seat at the dining table. The room stilled as everyone turned their attention to her, sensing she had something important to say. Mary took a deep breath, glancing around at the faces of the people who mattered most. Her mother, her father, the friends and colleagues who had stood by her when things seemed impossible. "I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through," she began, her voice steady but full of emotion. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that life isn't always fair. Sometimes it throws things at you that you aren't ready for. Sometimes it feels like everything is working against you." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. Albert and Helena watched her with quiet pride, their expressions soft with love and admiration. "But even in the hardest moments," Mary continued, "you have to hold on to hope. You have to believe that things can get better, that there's a way forward, even when you can't see it yet." She smiled, a small but radiant smile that lit up the room. "I'm grateful for everyone who believed in me," she said, her voice thick with sincerity. "For everyone who gave me a chance, even when I wasn't sure if I deserved it. You've shown me that with courage, love, and a little bit of stubbornness, it's possible to turn even the worst situations into something beautiful." Her eyes landed on Albert and Helena, and she held their gaze for a moment longer. "Mom, Dad," she said softly, the words still feeling new but right on her tongue. "I wouldn't be standing here without you. Thank you for everything." Helena dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, smiling through tears. Albert's chest tightened with emotion, and he gave Mary a small nod, too moved to speak. The room erupted into applause, warm and genuine, and for a moment, Mary let herself bask in the joy of it. She had fought so hard to get here, and now she stood tall, knowing that she had not only survived but thrived. In the weeks that followed, the business continued to grow, but it was no longer just about flowers or profits. It was about purpose, about creating beauty, spreading hope, and making a difference in every way they could. Mary found herself invited to speak at events and conferences, sharing her story with others who needed to hear it. Her words resonated with people from all walks of life, inspiring them to believe in second chances and the power of perseverance. And though Beatrice was no longer part of the business, Albert kept the door open for her return, hoping that, in time, she too would find her way back to the family she had tried so hard to push away. As for Mary, she had found something far more valuable than success. She had found herself, her voice, her strength, and the knowledge that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. No longer just a girl selling flowers on the street corner, Mary had become a beacon of hope. She had transformed not only her own life, but the lives of those around her, proving that with love, courage, and unwavering integrity, even the most daunting obstacles could be overcome. And in the end, Mary knew one thing for certain. She wasn't just surviving, she was flourishing. If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.